element of that test is the most important. So, who controls not only the results, but the means. Um, Similar to the US and in other countries, it's really going to look at the behaviors to determine if the person should be an independent contractor or an employee. Who determines the manner, methods of work, who provides the tools. What's the engagement? Is this a project based or indefinite based? Can this person hire somebody and subcontract out? How is this person paid? Are they submitting timesheets, or are they billing at project milestones? Those types of things. And you also said something I want to capitalize on, and that's a change in executive leadership. So while this is employment law and you might have exposure on the employment side, on the US side, you may have some federal liability on the tax side. If you misclassify somebody incorrectly, our current government is very keep jobs in America. So you might be on the radar screen for them to say, wait a minute, you inappropriately went outside the country to do this work. So that might put you on a different radar altogether.
Yeah, and let me, you just answered my question, but I'm going to ask you more outright, and maybe you can elaborate on it. Why should some little US company care? I mean, what I've heard people say is, seriously, lady, like I do $500,000 a year, the IRS is not looking at me. Who cares if I hire these international workers? They're like, what is the Philippines going to do to me? So maybe you can answer that. Like, what is the Philippines going to do to me? But then maybe highlight that it's not just the Philippines anymore. Our own government is looking at targeting internal company organizations, like US based organizations for this activity.
So if an employee is misclassified in the Philippines, to your point, they could get judgment in the Philippines and then they could bring that judgment to the US and have it enforced. So likelihood of that happening, I don't know. We haven't seen it happen, but doesn't mean it couldn't.
Yeah.
And as far as being too small to be on the IRS radar, yes, there have been downsizing in the IRS. There are fewer agents, but it's a risk tolerance. Are you willing to pay the fines and penalties if you get it wrong?
All right. So I'm sure that we have probably already scared business owners, and they're already thinking, well, we're not going to do that. But sometimes it's not the owners and the leadership that are engaging these international workers. So what are you seeing from managers? What are managers doing with offshore work that's creating high risk situations for the organization as a whole?
It might be that your supply chain or your purchasing department is entering into these agreements without visibility to leadership. So if they're entering into these agreements and they're thinking, oh, wait, we have this contract and the other party signed and we signed, we're good to go. You're not. You can have a beautifully written contract, but if the terms don't comply with the law, it's irrelevant. So if you have managers that are engaging individuals to perform services and they're incorrectly classifying them because they have a purchase order or an agreement of some sort, if the legal framework isn't correct, that contract isn't worth the paper it's written on. And I'm going to anticipate your next question. What if we use an intermediary to pay them?
Yeah.
Doesn't that get us off the hook? That's an easy answer. No, it doesn't. In the Philippines, for example, they don't care that you used an independent platform to pay the worker and you did not pay them directly. You set up the arrangement. You are getting the benefit of the service. You are paying money for that service, regardless of whether you pay it directly to the worker or a different platform in between.
Yeah, and I'm a attorney that came out of being a buyer. So when I was in law school, I worked as a buyer. When I made some interstate transitions because of my family, there was a period where I went back to being a purchaser again. And purchasing organizations, sometimes including the HR department, are authorized to enter into contracts to contract with people. And if it hasn't been called out for these non-legal specialist organizations, like the departments um, that these international contracts have to be regarded differently. I can see how an innocent HR manager, an innocent mid-level manager, senior level manager wouldn't realize there's a distinction between what I'm allowed to do to hire temporary workers on the one hand and hire temporary workers who are international on the other. Those rules just might not exist in organizations.
Well, and depending on the size of the organization, who they contract with,
Yeah.
you may have vendor or supplier audits that you confirm you meet all the international laws when it comes to hiring, and you're going to say yes because you don't know what they are. So, on a caveat, something we're not talking about, it's not a bad idea to have your HR department, or I'm sorry, your legal department or outside counsel look at those audits before you complete them to ensure that what you're certifying is accurate.
Yeah, I think that's right. All right, let's transition a little bit back um, to punishments. So if we talk about sort of the worst case reality, if somebody, again, we keep using the Philippines as the example, but it could be anywhere. If somebody overseas does win a judgment against you, what does that mean for a company in the US? Like, how does that actually become a debt that I, as a US company, might hold?
So the foreign court that issued the judgment would have to have the attorney for the worker, for example, would take that judgment to a court that has jurisdiction over the matter and file it for enforcement.
All right.
So you're
Okay.
sitting in Harris County. I'm sitting in Harris County. They would take it to the local courts and they would file it, and then it becomes a judgment in the state of Texas and enforceable in the state of Texas.
So you, Renee, I was a purchaser that turned into a lawyer. You were a soldier that turned into a lawyer. What does it mean if I want to have any government or military money and I have one of these issues related to collecting on a judgment for international workers on my sort of record? Can I get money from the government? Can I continue to do government work?
Maybe. So the contracting officer typically does an audit before securing a vendor, before authorizing a vendor. And so judgments against you, criminal conduct, misconduct with regard to contracts, previous contracts, all weigh into whether you become an approved vendor
Yeah,
for a new contract or a renewal.
right.
So it could impact your ability to contract with the federal government.
And let's be honest, those contracts are 30, 50, 150 pages long, and I can guarantee you somewhere in there it says something like don't hire international folks for stuff with security, but most people
Oh,
have never read
sure.
it.
Yeah, for sure. Anything with a national security interest or potential link to national security is going to define who can work on that contract. So it's really important to pay attention to that.
Yeah, and I think that national security is always super broadly construed in those cases.
And it's becoming even more confiscated, convoluted in today's world because this America first mentality and anti-immigration stuff is really positioning it so that employers are having a harder time justifying labor outside of the US.
Yeah. All right, let's get a little more brass tacks. Are there any lines that you draw where you say international workers should not touch this, or good God, don't let your international workers touch that? Is it HR? Is it employee data, customer data? What are the areas that you think of when you think of maybe appropriate, absolutely not appropriate work for international employees or international folks to do in our client organizations?
It's going to depend. So when you mentioned employment stuff, it made me think of the privacy regulations in different countries. So if you are an international employer and you have employees in the UK or in the EU, and they have very strong data protection laws. And so if you have a worker sitting in the Philippines accessing personal health information, personal identification information, stuff that's protected under the privacy laws, you may be inadvertently violating it. It might be okay to access that information in the US based on the firewalls you've set up, but it may not extend to that person working virtually in the Philippines. So you really have to look at data protection to make sure that you are in compliance with the laws. Same thing, some California has very strong consumer protection. And so you need to make sure that if you're sharing information outside of the US on US based companies, that you're not inadvertently violating a state law. So it's really a question of data security versus topic.
Yeah, I think that's right. What about, let's jump back actually again to this pro-American anti-offshoring sentiment. One of the ways that we're learning or is it starting to land is that this doesn't just become a lawyering problem now, right? So now we have taxation issues. And those are starting to become triggers. We talked about the IRS a little bit earlier. What are any of the restrictions or penalties? I mean, I hope everybody knows that when you contract with somebody internationally, you do have to collect tax records, just like if they were a domestic independent contractor, you have to collect the international version of that 1099. And
W-9, sorry.
39, sorry, thank you. The international version of that. And then, but what else are you seeing as far as compliance for when we do have international workers that we're working with?
Proper work authorization.
Hmm.
So making sure that if you're hiring a remote worker and that worker's traveling as part of their job, do they have the appropriate visas to work in the countries where they might be traveling to?
Hey, Renee,
Yeah.
I never hit record.
Holy shit. We got all that good dialogue.
It was so good.
Yes, it is. This meeting is being recorded.
Oh, fuck. Okay.
Girl.
Hey, Mary Beth, cut this part out. Why? Okay. Holy shit. Let's just do that last one again. Oh my God. I'm so sorry to give you a heart attack and it to be a false alarm.
Our first Acorn meeting was coming back in vivid memory.
Well, I think that's why I was like, ah. Anyway, Mary Beth, cut this out.
And make me look younger.
Um, okay, so I was asking about pro-America, anti-offshoring.
Well, I think we need to be clear. We're not expressing our political views. We are commenting on the current state of affairs.
Yeah, yeah,
Just to
yeah.
be clear.
Okay, take two. All right, so Renee, if we can just go back and revisit the articulated sentiment of the pro-America or anti-offshoring current administration as they articulate to us. This isn't anything about what we think about the scenario. It is the official stance of our government as it is actually landing for our client organizations. Um, and some of the nuts and bolts of that are around the compliance piece of it landing with the IRS, not just things that you see in the news where it's not ICE, it's not customs enforcement. I mean, maybe it could be. It's not just the court system and landing a judgment from overseas domestically. It's also coming from the IRS. Hopefully, all of our organizations know that there is a international version of the I-9 that you need to be collecting when you bring on an international contractor, just as if they were a domestic one. It's just the sister form that you use to bring on those folks. But what other compliance risks are there fiscally, through agencies? What other risks of compliance are there when we bring on international workers?
When we bring them on as employees or independent
As
contractors.
contractors, and how is it different under this administration? Or maybe how do you think it'll be different under this administration?
From an IC perspective, if they're properly classified, it's a contract issue. So, the risks, the penalties aren't as severe as they are if you've misclassified that IC and they are actually a worker.
And when you say that, do you mean classification by our laws or theirs or both?
Their laws. Their laws are what dictate whether they are an independent contractor or an employment law, an employee. Similar to the U.S., when you're looking at a company that has offices across the U.S., it's the state where the employee works that dictates employment compliance. Internationally, same thing. It's where that individual is performing the work that determines which laws apply. So every state has, or just every state, every country has different penalties, different fines. There might be more than one agency that is going to come knocking at your door if you get this wrong.
So, do you have any predictions for us about what might change through the rest of this administration on these international worker issues?
The actions of Homeland Security, the actions of the president have made it very clear that there is a presumption that the work needs to be done in the US by somebody that holds a proper work authorization to do the work. We've seen there was earlier 2025 that there was going to be this huge fine fee associated with the H-1B. Luckily, that's gone away. We've seen that there's been changes to the H-1B lottery process. So not only is there a crackdown on what is termed illegal immigration, but there's also a crackdown on legal immigration to make it harder to allow work to be done by non-US citizens, non-green card holders.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, so as somebody who has done so much general counsel work, who has done so much general counsel work for international organizations, tell me how you're engaging with your various stakeholders and leaders and organizational heads to create a policy governing how your organization would handle the desire to use international virtual workers in the organization. How do you, as a general counsel to clients or to your own organization, build out that program?
Part of it is supply chain oriented,
Yeah.
making sure that contracts are properly reviewed before signed. Part of it's an HR process, making sure that employment agreements or temporary labor agreements are properly vetted by legal counsel. And then the other thing is engaging local counsel on the grounds so
Local to
that
the VA or local to
local
the worker.
local to the country where the person is performing the job to make sure, you know, ChatGPT has invaded the world. And yes, you can go on ChatGPT and ask it, and it'll give you some starting points, but it's not the ending point. So even though I'm licensed, I never enter into a contract or review terms independent without going to some law firm, some attorney, solicitor, barrister, whatever they're going to call themselves in the country where they practice, to make sure that there isn't a change in the law, but they can also give you what's changing in the environment. We've talked a lot today about how the executive branch influences the judicial branch, if you will. So having that local eyes on it can really give you the unspoken, unwritten policies about how things are enforced, and that's invaluable.
All right. So we've created a situation where we have or have not, but probably for this scenario, have decided that there are some ways that our organization is going to bring in virtual international workers. They're here. What happens when those people start complaining that, I'm being treated unfairly, I've been sexually harassed, which can happen virtually, and internationally. I am not being paid as much as other people. All these things that come up as employee I need to change my hours and you're not letting me. How do we deal with those complaints from our international contract workers overseas?
It's a contract. So if the terms and conditions of employment are no longer agreeable, we can end the contract and we can search for a replacement, or they can end the contract and search for a new company to contract with. Now, the harassment and discrimination,
Mhm.
although they don't have legal protections, if I'm working in an organization where that behavior is happening, I definitely want to know about it.
Yeah.
I may not have a legal obligation the way I do in the US under Title VII, but I have an obligation to the organization to make sure those things aren't happening and correct that type of behavior because it negatively impacts culture.
Yeah,
So I still want to know it.
the
Sorry.
phraseology I always use is it doesn't matter who reports, you're now on notice that you have a harasser in your workplace or a potential harasser in your workplace. It doesn't matter if it was the mailman or an international worker or somebody you employ, you're still on notice. But anyway, I
Well, and,
interrupted you.
and the law is the floor, not the ceiling. We can
Right.
always do better than the law. And so, even though legally we don't have any obligations, as an organization, we definitely probably want to hold ourselves to a much higher standard when it comes to contact in the workplace. So I'm going to investigate that claim as if it happened inside the organization, inside the US. And if there is a violation, correct it.
Yeah,
So I don't legally have to.
and to go backwards to some of your earlier comments, it's a contract. We need to see what the contract says about the complaints the person is making. That means we have to have a decent contract, whether it's with a platform for acquisition of these workers or directly with the worker. We have to have a contract that covers all the what ifs in a way that is usable in the real world, um, and in accordance with the understanding of the organization and the worker, or and the platform. Um, and so often we just don't see that. People think, oh, these people are international. They're so far removed from our world. Like we don't, who cares? We don't need to take this seriously. We'll just click through this contract.
Recently, I was working with a client that had an issue where it was a software contract and the IT department negotiated and worked through it. Um, they didn't use the company's standard terms and conditions. They accepted what the software vendor was demanding, for lack of a better term. And as a result of an audit, the software companies come back and said, you are not in compliance with the terms of the agreement. And it came down to a definition in the contract. And the definition that the contract used was a much more narrow definition of a word than is commonly accepted in contract language. So that company may be on the hook for that violation because somebody signed that agreement. Whether that person had actual authority to sign the contract isn't going to be relevant because they had apparent authority. They were in a position where it would be reasonable to assume that they did have the ability to sign that contract.
And they've been working
As
under it.
they had been working under it. And everybody thought, well, it's IT. IT owns it. They did it. Now it's the rest of us that are working through it, going, okay, how do we fix this? So every company should have a standard practice for contracts being reviewed by a contracts person. Does that need to be a lawyer? Not necessarily. And I know that makes some people cringe. But if you have a supply chain manager or a compliance manager that has done this forever and they're reviewing the language, they can flag it that it's inconsistent with other contracts, and then you bring it to legal for actual negotiation and advice, legal advice.
Mhm.
But these should not be independently reviewed by the department that doesn't have expertise in reading these things.
All right. Renee, any last thoughts about the current state of affairs or the future of client organizations hiring international virtual workers into US organizations?
I get the appeal. You know, the cost of living in the Philippines is much less, and what you pay on an hourly rate is much less.
Yeah,
But if you're going to expect that virtual assistant in the Philippines to perform the same as you would an assistant in the US, and you're going to tell them the hours, and you're going to give them the tools, and you're going to tell them how you want things done, you're not hiring an independent contractor, you're hiring an employee.
yeah, yep. All right. Well, thank you for spending time with me.
I
Thank
loved
you.
it.
This is so important right now. It's getting the work we did on this is getting so much attention right now. I think this follow-up is really, really important. So
Agreed.
thank you.
It's definitely going to be something that hits the news.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Thank you.